Support comes from the Rosa Parks Museum on Troy University's Montgomery campus. Located on the spot of Mrs. Parks' historic 1955 arrest and featuring exhibits that chronicle the history of the Montgomery bus boycott. More information at troy.edu/Rosa Parks.
If it's Monday at 12:40, then it must be time for TPR Podcast Presents. I'm Austin Toy. Every week, we bring you selections from one of Troy Public Radio's 13 locally produced podcasts. Things are commonly said to be like a train wreck if they're horrific, yet fascinating, so terrible that you just can't look away. On this selection from the It Came From the Archives podcast, host Greg Phillips and historian Marty Olaf discuss two literal train wrecks from Wiregrass history, the photos of which are part of the Wiregrass archives. This is their conversation.
This 1917 accident was truly spectacular. Engineer Richard G., known as Dick Morgan, and his fireman W. Brown Hunter were driving the Atlantic Coastline passenger train number 57. The engines have numbers, the trains have numbers. They were going northbound from Dothan on Sunday, June 24th, 1916, at about 6:20 a.m. They rounded a curve about a mile north of Dillard, which is about 5 miles north of Ozark. The rail beneath them apparently sprung out of alignment, and it threw the train into the ditch, a pretty deep ditch that was on the side of the rail embankment. Now, these photographs, they're horrendous. They're horrendous. It's after the fact. People are crawling all over this train wreckage. The engine that was thrown down into the gully looks actually to me to be deflated. It's pushed so far down into the dirt on its side that it actually looks like air has been let out of it. It's remarkable. That engine pinned and suffocated Dick Morgan, the engineer, and the newspapers reported that he continually held on. He was found deceased, holding on to the controls like he was still trying to steer the train. And so the newspapers make kind of a big deal about that, how heroic he was. And it only trapped that fireman, Brown Hunter. What happened to Brown Hunter was worse than what happened to Dick Morgan. He was alive, he was alert, he was talking to people. They couldn't get him out, but he wasn't in a lot of danger until a steam pipe burst and scalded him to death. But he didn't die immediately. He remained alive for an hour after he was scalded and after all of the steam hit him. It's just terrible. Morgan, the engineer, was 53. And of course, ironically enough, he was just about to retire, having served 30 years on the line. And Hunter, who was only 29, had been with ACL Atlantic Coastline for about a decade. This wreck, because people loved Dick Morgan, people in railroad and people that knew him in Montgomery as neighbors, and everybody loved Dick Morgan. And so the site of that accident for years after that was called the Dick Morgan Curve. And you can see it on the map. It's a big, long curve, and it just took a few spikes to turn loose before it became the Dick Morgan turn.
It mentions here that he was considered one of the pioneer railmen of Montgomery, according to the Montgomery Advertiser at the time. And having worked in railroads for 30 years, I'm no math expert, but that puts, he would have had to be one of the earliest railroad people in this area.
1887, I suspect, if he was pushing 30 years, he started between 1887 and 1890 in railroads. One of the first rail line to come to southeast Alabama out of Montgomery was what became the Atlantic Coast, the Alabama Midland Railroad that was commissioned by a group in Troy itself. And a bunch of the highfalutin business people in Troy, like O.C. Wiley, became heavily involved in that push. So this next wreck that is in the Solomon photographs occurred in 1945. And on September 24th at 2:05 p.m., Atlantic coastline train known as the Extra 452 West, because these trains are not easily numbered, coming out of Dothan, collided headlong into the Atlantic coastline second 180 East. It killed the engineer in the 452. His name was James Mangum. He was also of Montgomery, and it injured 16 other people. So the Interstate Commerce Commission investigated this particular accident, and in its report, it noted that the ACL line from Waycross through Dothan up to Montgomery was single track. So you got two trains on the same track going in opposite directions. Something's going to give, right? Well, they had a way to deal with this that was a little bit older and kind of complicated. So governing those train movements to prevent wrecks required designating one of the trains as the superior train and one of them as the inferior train. So you got a superior train and inferior train. Then the railroad had to issue strict orders to the inferior train to pull onto a siding at a particular time. We know by our schedule that you guys are going to be on the same block of track for a while, at 2:10 p.m., for example. And so at 1:45, you, the inferior train, have to pull off at the siding 3 miles away from this particular point so that train can pass you, and then you back up and get back on the track, and off you go. And to make that work requires on the absolute shakiest foundation that the people on the train will do what they're told. The Extra 452 in this case was the inferior train. It consisted of a locomotive, a tender, and a caboose. A 3-car train. The train, second 180, was superior, and it was pulled by an engine driven by engineer Jim Potter of Montgomery, and it consisted of 6 unoccupied Pullman cars. So just the train crew on that one, just 3 or 4 people on the other train. Solomon's photos and this ICS report tell us that engine 452, train Extra 452 West, the carriage and the boiler, when they hit so hard that it tore them apart. That is, the impact tore the boiler off of the carriage and threw them off separately. The cab slammed forward, and that's what killed the engineer, Mangum. The locomotive then twisted off the track, and the tender hit the locomotive in the rear and lifted it up into the air. So that when the train stopped, this locomotive housing, which had been slammed forward, was sitting up in the air. The caboose shattered. It was a wooden car and just splintered. And that's where most of the injuries occurred. This other train, the second 180, its locomotive derailed. It landed on the right side next to the track. Its tender and only the front carriage of its first passenger car derailed. So it did not suffer greatly from this. In talking with the ICC, the fireman on the 452 said that Mangum, the engineer on the 452, hadn't pulled into the siding at Youngblood, Alabama. And so I asked him about it, and Mangum just brushed him off, said, "We don't need to pull over because we're going to stop very suddenly in just a few minutes." The ICC concluded, quote, that this accident was caused by an inferior train occupying the main track on the time of an opposing superior train, in good ICC bureaucraties.
You can hear the full conversation with Marty and Greg on the It Came From the Archives podcast on NPR One or at today.troy.edu/podcasts. I'm Austin Toy, and this is TPR Podcast Presents on listener-supported Troy Public Radio.